Dr. Aisha Rahman stood on the edge of the wooden pier, watching the sun rise over the sea. The waves were calm that morning, a soft golden light spreading across the water. To anyone else it looked peaceful, even perfect. But Aisha saw something others didn't. The dying coral beneath the surface, the fading colors that once painted the seabed like a rainbow. The ocean she had grown up loving was slowly losing its life, and she could feel its silent cry. Aisha had been working as a marine biologist in the small coastal town of Marang for 8 years. She loved her job deeply. Every morning she would ride her old blue bicycle to the research center near the docks, carrying her notebook and camera. The townspeople often waved at her as she passed by, calling her Doctor of the Sea. They respected her kindness but didn't really understand her passion. To them, the ocean was just a source of fish and salt, not a living world that needed care. In her small lab, filled with jars of sea samples and photographs of coral reefs, Aisha had been studying the changes in the water temperature and the growing pollution. She had noticed that the coral reefs, the heart of marine life, were turning pale. The colorful coral that used to attract fish and tourists alike was now white, brittle, and lifeless. She took pictures, ran tests, and wrote reports. Each report told the same story. The sea was dying, slowly but surely. She tried to warn everyone. She sent letters to the local council, arranged meetings with the town's mayor, and spoke on local radio. Her voice was calm but full of urgency. She explained how the factories dumping waste into the river were poisoning the water that flowed into the sea. She showed graphs of temperature rising every year, and spoke about the greenhouse gases that made the ocean warmer. "The Earth is warning us," she said in every meeting. "If we don't act now, it will be too late." But people listened with polite smiles and then went back to their daily routines. The mayor nodded and said, "You're doing great work, Doctor. But we can't just shut down the factories. They bring jobs." The fishermen told her they had been fishing the same way for generations and didn't see any reason to change. Even her colleagues at the research center sometimes teased her for being too emotional about the sea. "You sound like you think the ocean has feelings," one joked. Aisha only smiled and said quietly, "It does if you learn how to listen." Despite the frustration, she didn't give up. She went diving every week to collect data. Underwater, she felt peace but also pain. The silence of the ocean spoke louder than any human voice. The coral that once danced with life now looked like a graveyard. Fish moved in smaller numbers and plastic waste floated like ghosts above the reefs. Every dive felt like a visit to an old friend who was slowly fading away. Back in town, life continued as usual. Children played near the shore, throwing stones into the water. Fishermen mended their nets, laughing and sharing tea. The factories across the bay hummed day and night, their chimneys sending dark smoke into the sky. To them, progress meant more machines, more buildings, and more trade ships. The economy was growing, they said proudly. Nobody wanted to hear that their success might be built on a silent disaster. One evening, Aisha sat by the window of her small house, watching the lights of the town reflect on the sea. She opened her old notebook and flipped through her notes. There were pages filled with numbers, dates, and warnings. She felt tired but determined. Her parents had taught her to love nature when she was young. Her father was a fisherman who used to take her out to the sea before sunrise. He would tell her, "The sea is alive, Aisha. Treat it like a friend, and it will feed you for life." But now she wondered if anyone still remembered those words. The next morning, she decided to organize a community talk at the town hall. She invited teachers, fishermen, and factory owners. Only a few showed up. She began her presentation with photos of coral reefs from 10 years ago, bright, colorful, and full of fish. Then she showed the same locations today, pale, empty, and silent. "This is not just science," she said. "This is our home changing before our eyes. We cannot ignore it." Some people nodded. Others looked uncomfortable. One factory owner said, "Even if what you say is true, what can we do? The world is changing. One small town cannot stop it." Aisha replied softly, "But one small town can start it." After the meeting, she walked home feeling both proud and hopeless. She had spoken the truth, but truth alone wasn't enough. She remembered the old proverb her grandmother used to say, "You can't wake someone who pretends to sleep." Maybe that was what was happening. People saw the signs, but they didn't want to believe them. Denial was easier than action. Days turned into weeks. Aisha kept collecting data, hoping for some improvement, but the results got worse. The water near the factories showed high levels of toxic waste. Fishermen complained about fewer catches, but they still blamed bad luck instead of pollution. Tourists began to notice the dull, colorless water and stopped coming as often. The town's economy started to slow, but no one connected it to the dying ocean. It was as if everyone was trapped in a dream of denial. One afternoon, while walking along the shore, Aisha found a young boy crying beside a stranded turtle tangled in plastic ropes. She quickly helped free the turtle and guided it back into the water. The boy looked at her with wide eyes and said, "Why do people throw garbage in the sea?" Aisha knelt down and smiled sadly. "Because they forget that the sea is alive," she said. The boy nodded as if he understood something deeper than most adults. That moment stayed with her. She began teaching children at the local school about marine life. She showed them pictures of coral reefs, fish species, and sea plants. She told them stories about how every creature in the ocean mattered. The children listened with excitement and curiosity. Some even went home and told their parents to stop dumping waste near the shore. It gave Aisha a small spark of hope. But as she looked at the horizon, she couldn't ignore the signs. The weather was changing. The sea tides were becoming stronger, unpredictable. The sunsets looked strange, with clouds that glowed an unnatural red. Fishermen whispered about storms coming more often, but nobody connected it to the changes Aisha had been warning about for years. At night, she lay in bed listening to the waves. She could hear them crash harder than before, as if the ocean was trying to speak. Sometimes she dreamed of the sea crying, a low, deep sound that echoed through the air. She would wake up sweating, feeling a sense of dread she couldn't explain. She began to write in her journal, "The earth is not silent. We are the ones who have gone deaf." A few weeks later, a government inspection team arrived to assess the pollution levels. Aisha guided them through her data and showed them samples. The officials listened politely, took notes, and promised to report their findings to higher authorities. But deep down, Aisha knew the truth. By the time the system reacted, the damage would already be done. Still, she refused to give up. Every morning, she stood on the same pier and watched the sunrise. It reminded her of why she started this work. The golden light still reflected on the waves, just like when she was a child. For a moment, it almost looked as if nothing had changed, but she knew better. Beneath that beautiful surface, something was breaking. The sea was warning them again and again, and though her voice seemed small against the noise of the world, she kept speaking. Because Aisha believed that even one voice could make a difference, just like one cry from the earth could awaken millions, if only they chose to listen. The year 2028 began with strange changes in Meringue. The mornings, once filled with the soft songs of seabirds and the laughter of fishermen, felt quieter now. The sea looked different too. It no longer sparkled under the sun the way it used to. Its color had turned dull and a strange smell hung in the air. People noticed it, but they didn't talk much about it. They said it was just nature's mood or a passing season. But for Dr. Aisha Rahman, these were not small changes. They were signs of something serious. Every morning, Aisha continued her routine at the Marine Research Center. Her team had reduced to only 2 assistants now because of funding cuts. Even then, she worked from sunrise till late evening, studying the samples she collected from the sea. The results made her heart sink each time. The oxygen levels in the water had dropped, the pH was becoming more acidic, and strange algae had begun to grow near the shores, choking the coral reefs even further. The fish population was decreasing fast, and some species she had once seen daily had completely vanished. She kept a journal where she wrote everything in simple words so people could understand. The sea is sick. Its fever is rising. The air, the heat, and the waste are making it weaker. But no one seemed to care enough to read her notes. The government offices were busy with election campaigns. The factory owners were expanding their plants, and the townspeople were focused on earning enough to survive. One afternoon, Aisha walked through the local fish market. The stalls looked emptier than before. The fishermen complained that their catches were smaller. Some had to go farther out into the sea to find fish. "The sea is hiding from us," one old fisherman joked. But his laugh didn't hide the worry in his eyes. The fish they did bring back looked unhealthy. Some had strange marks on their bodies, and others smelled odd even before being cooked. Aisha decided to test the fish samples in her lab. The results confirmed her worst fears. The fish had absorbed toxic chemicals from the polluted water. The factories dumping waste into the river had turned it into a poisonous stream, and that poison had reached the ocean. When Aisha presented her findings to the local council, she expected concern, maybe even action. But instead she was met with silence and excuses. One councilman said, "These are just temporary problems. We can't afford to stop production. People need jobs." Another added, "Nature fixes itself." "It always does," Aisha wanted to shout, to tell them that nature could not fix everything once humans pushed it too far. But she stayed calm and said, "Nature heals when we stop hurting it. But we are not stopping. We are only hurting it more." Her words seemed to vanish in the air unheard. Days passed and the signs grew worse. The once blue waters turned murky brown near the shore. Plastic bottles, wrappers, and even dead fish floated on the surface. Birds that used to dive into the water for food began to disappear too. The mangrove trees, which had always protected the coastline, started to dry out. Their roots, once firm and green, turned black and brittle. Then came the strange winds. They blew harder and earlier than usual. The air carried a salty bitterness that stung the eyes. Aisha felt a heavy sadness every time she looked at the horizon. The sea seemed angry, restless. She often told her assistants, "It's like the ocean is trying to tell us something." They nodded quietly, not sure how to reply. One evening, Aisha was sitting on the beach, taking notes as the tide rose higher than normal. The waves seemed unpredictable, as if they had lost their rhythm. Suddenly, she noticed something floating toward her, a mass of dead jellyfish. She ran into the water to inspect them. Their translucent bodies looked pale and lifeless. There were dozens of them. "Even jellyfish are dying," she whispered. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept seeing the lifeless jellyfish in her dreams, floating like sad ghosts under the moonlight. Soon, the sickness began to touch human lives too. Villagers living near the shore started complaining about skin rashes and stomach problems. Some said the tap water tasted strange. Aisha collected water samples from different parts of the town and sent them for testing. The results came back showing high levels of heavy metals, mercury and lead. The polluted river had mixed with the groundwater. People were drinking poison without knowing it. She immediately went to the local health department and showed them the results. "If we don't act, this will turn into a health crisis," she said. But the officials only promised to look into it. They said they needed approval from higher authorities. The delay broke Aisha's heart. "The ocean doesn't wait for paperwork," she said under her breath as she walked out of the office. One morning, the fishermen returned from the sea earlier than usual. Their faces were pale with fear. They told Aisha that the sea had changed overnight. "We saw dark water miles from the coast," one of them said, "and the fish are gone. Not even one caught in the net." Aisha asked them to take her to the site. She joined them on their boat, and as they sailed into the open sea, she saw it with her own eyes. A wide patch of blackish water stretching far and wide. It was like a wound in the heart of the ocean. The smell was unbearable, a mix of oil and rot. She took water samples, trying to stay calm. "This is a dead zone," she whispered. It was a place where nothing could live because the oxygen had been sucked out by pollution. The fishermen looked at her helplessly. "What do we do now?" one asked. She didn't know what to say. For the first time, Aisha felt truly powerless. In the following weeks, news began to spread beyond Marang. Environmental groups posted pictures online showing the black water and dying fish. Some people began to realize that Aisha's warnings had been true all along. But it was too late. The ecosystem was already collapsing. The coral reefs, once full of color, had turned completely white. The seabed was covered in layers of sludge. Even the crabs and shells that children used to collect had disappeared. Aisha felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. Every day she returned home exhausted, her clothes smelling of salt and chemicals. But she kept working, recording, and reporting. Her only hope was that someone, somewhere, would finally listen. Then one afternoon, dark clouds gathered over the bay. The wind picked up suddenly and the waves grew taller. The sky turned gray and thunder rolled in the distance. It wasn't storm season yet, but the weather didn't seem to follow rules anymore. Aisha stood outside her lab, staring at the ocean as the first drops of rain fell. It was warm rain, too warm for comfort. "The sea is changing faster than we thought," she whispered. As the storm passed, she went to check the coastline. Parts of the beach had eroded. Entire stretches of sand had vanished overnight. The sea had moved closer to the town. She realized that the rising temperature and melting polar ice were not distant issues. They were here, in her own backyard. A few days later, she received satellite data from an international research network she was part of. The data confirmed that sea levels around Meringue had risen by nearly 20 centimeters in just 3 years, an alarming rate. The email also mentioned that global ocean temperatures were at their highest in recorded history. It wasn't just her town. It was the entire planet facing the same crisis. Isha sat in her office, staring at the numbers on her computer screen. She thought about the people who had ignored her, the officials who had smiled politely, and the factories that still dumped waste every night. Her hands trembled as she closed her eyes. "We were warned," she said softly. "The Earth warned us again and again." That night, she walked down to the pier and stood where she had once watched the golden sunrises. But now the sky looked heavy and the sea was rough. The reflection of the town's lights wobbled on the waves as if the ocean itself was restless. She could almost hear it whisper, a low, deep sound that felt like pain. She realized then that nature had reached its breaking point. The ocean, once calm and nurturing, was beginning to fight back. The balance that had kept life stable for centuries was now broken. She knew what was coming next. She didn't know when or how big it would be, but she could feel it deep in her heart. Aisha returned home, drenched from the sea breeze, and sat by her window with her journal. On a new page, she wrote, "The Earth has limits. When we cross them, it doesn't stay silent. It answers." Outside, thunder echoed again over the sea and lightning flashed across the horizon. It was as if the sky itself was warning her. The fury of nature was only beginning to rise. The night the storm arrived, everything in Meringue changed forever. The day had started quietly with a strange stillness in the air. The sea was calm, too calm, and the sky had a color Aisha had never seen before, gray mixed with a faint shade of green. The fishermen stayed on land, saying the sea didn't look right. Even the birds that usually circled above the shore had disappeared. Aisha felt uneasy. For days she had been monitoring the pressure and wind patterns. Everything pointed toward something big, something dangerous. She called the local authorities to warn them, but they dismissed her concern. "There's no cyclone alert yet," one officer told her. But Aisha's instincts told her otherwise. The ocean was too silent. It was the silence that comes before chaos. By evening, dark clouds began rolling in from the horizon. The wind started to pick up, bending the palm trees along the beach. The waves grew larger, crashing against the rocks with a force that shook the ground. People began to notice the change. Mothers called their children inside. Shopkeepers hurried to close their stalls and fishermen pulled their boats further inland. Aisha stood at her window watching the sea grow angrier with every passing minute. She could feel it in her bones. This was not an ordinary storm. This was nature's fury unleashed. By nightfall, the wind had turned violent. It howled through the streets, tearing off rooftops and snapping electric poles like matchsticks. The rain came next, heavy, wild, and unending. Within minutes, the streets were flooded. Aisha's research center, just a few meters from the shore, shook under the force of the wind. She grabbed her emergency kit, laptop, and some important research papers and ran to secure the doors and windows. Water began to leak through the cracks. The power went out and the world turned dark except for the lightning flashing across the sky. Outside, chaos had begun. The storm was no longer just weather. It was destruction in motion. The waves, taller than houses, smashed into the coastline, sweeping away boats, walls, and anything that stood in their path. People screamed, running for shelter. The sound of the wind was deafening, a roar that drowned every other noise. The ocean, once calm and gentle, had become a monster. Aisha tried to contact her colleagues, but the network was dead. She grabbed her flashlight and rushed outside to help whoever she could. The rain hit her face like tiny knives, and the wind nearly threw her off balance. She could barely see more than a few feet ahead. As she waded through knee-deep water, she saw a family struggling to climb onto the roof of a small shop. Without thinking, she ran to help. Together they pulled the children up first, then the parents. The waves crashed dangerously close, but they managed to hold on. The mother cried out, "Is it over?" Aisha shook her head. "No, this is just beginning," she shouted over the wind. Minutes felt like hours. The storm grew stronger. The sound of breaking glass, collapsing roofs, and screaming wind filled the air. Trees were uprooted, Cars floated like paper toys, and streetlights fell one after another. The once busy streets of Marang were now rivers of debris. Aisha looked toward the ocean and saw something terrifying. The water level was rising. The tide had breached the seawall. She knew what that meant. A storm surge was coming. She screamed for everyone on the roof to hold on tight. A massive wave, taller than any she had ever seen, crashed over the shore. It swallowed everything in its path. Houses, shops, and roads disappeared under the roaring water. Aisha clung to a metal railing with all her strength as the wave hit. The cold water slammed into her body, pushing her backward, nearly pulling her into the sea. But somehow she managed to hold on. When the wave finally receded, everything looked different. The town was gone. The rain continued to fall and the wind showed no sign of stopping. Aisha pulled herself up and looked around. The people she had helped were crying, shivering, holding on to each other. The streets were unrecognizable. Pieces of wood, furniture, and broken glass floated everywhere. Fires had started in some places where electrical wires had fallen into the water. The smell of salt mud and smoke filled the air. It felt like the end of the world. As she stumbled through the wreckage, she found her way back toward her research center, or what was left of it. The roof was gone, the walls cracked, and all her equipment had been swept away. She fell to her knees in the water, tears mixing with the rain. Years of work, her data, her samples, everything was destroyed. She looked at the ocean, still roaring under the storm, and whispered, "You warned us. We didn't listen." Her voice was lost in the wind. Through the long night, Aisha and a few survivors gathered in an old-school building on higher ground. They used candles and flashlights to see. Children cried, mothers tried to comfort them, and the elderly sat silently, staring into the dark. Every time thunder struck, the whole building trembled. Some prayed, some whispered stories to stay calm. Aisha sat near the doorway, soaked and cold, her mind spinning with thoughts. She couldn't help but think about how many lives might have been lost. She wanted to do something, but all she could do was wait for the storm to pass. Hours went by, but the fury of the storm didn't stop. The sound of destruction echoed from every direction. Aisha thought about her family, her friends, and the town she had loved so much. All the beauty she had once admired, the coral reefs, the bright mornings, the peaceful waves, felt like a memory from another world. Now the same ocean she had studied with love had turned into a force of unstoppable anger. By early morning, the storm began to weaken. The wind slowed and the rain turned into a drizzle. The silence that followed was heavy and painful. Aisha stepped outside, her shoes sinking into thick mud. She looked around and could barely recognize the place. Houses were flattened, cars lay upside down, and the air was filled with the sound of crying and distant sirens. The ocean had pulled back, leaving behind piles of debris, dead fish, and shattered lives. Aisha walked through what used to be the main street. She found a small child sitting alone beside a broken wall holding a toy boat. The boy's clothes were torn and his eyes were blank. She knelt beside him and asked gently, "Where are your parents?" The boy didn't answer. He just pointed toward the sea. Aisha felt a lump in her throat. She picked him up and carried him toward the rescue camp that had begun to form near the hillside. The rescue teams arrived later that day from neighboring towns. Helicopters flew overhead, dropping supplies and searching for survivors. Aisha helped as much as she could, guiding people, treating the injured, and comforting the frightened. But inside she felt broken. Every face she saw reminded her of how unprepared they had been. She thought about the meetings she had attended, the warnings she had given, the data she had presented, all ignored. The storm had proven everything she had said, but the cost was unbearable. That evening, as the sun set behind the clouds, Aisha stood at the edge of what was once the pier. The wooden planks were gone, only a few posts remained, sticking out of the water like broken bones. The sea had calmed again, almost peaceful, as if nothing had happened. But Aisha knew better. She stared at the horizon, her eyes filled with tears. "Why did it have to come to this?" she whispered. "You tried to speak and we didn't listen. Now we have paid the price." She picked up a piece of driftwood and carved a few words into it using a sharp stone. "For those who didn't survive the sea's cry." She placed it near the shore as a small memorial for all the lost lives. Around her, survivors began lighting candles and placing flowers in the water. The flickering lights reflected on the waves, small but beautiful, like the heartbeat of hope trying to survive the pain. That night, Aisha sat near the fire with a group of survivors. A little girl asked her, "Will the sea be kind again?" Aisha looked at her gently and said, "The sea was never cruel. It was only tired of being hurt." The child nodded, not fully understanding, but her small smile gave Aisha strength. As the stars appeared through the clouds, Aisha realized that this storm was not just a tragedy. It was a message. Nature had spoken in the only way it knew how, and it had made sure the world would finally listen. She promised herself that she would not let this disaster fade into memory. The world needed to hear what had happened in Meringue. The fury of the earth had been unstoppable, but perhaps from that fury, a new beginning could rise. Aisha closed her eyes, listening to the soft sound of the waves. They no longer sounded angry. They sounded tired, like a heart that had finally cried out and now waited for someone to understand. The morning after the great storm, silence covered Meringue like a heavy blanket. There was no sound of waves crashing, no call of birds, no laughter from the fishermen who usually greeted the sunrise. The town that once lived by the rhythm of the sea now lay in ruins. Streets had disappeared under mud and broken wood. Houses were shattered, and boats were lying on rooftops or tangled in electric wires. The smell of salt, mud, and smoke filled the air. It was the smell of loss. Dr. Aisha Rahman walked slowly through what was left of her town. Her clothes were torn, her hair messy, and her eyes red from a sleepless night. She moved carefully between debris, sometimes stopping to help people searching for loved ones. Everywhere she looked, she saw broken memories. A doll half buried in the sand, a family photo stuck to a tree, a torn fishing net hanging from a window. The ocean, calm now, seemed almost innocent, as if it hadn't just destroyed everything in its path. She reached the spot where her research center had stood. What she saw made her heart ache. The building was almost gone. Only parts of the concrete wall remained standing, and the lab equipment that had taken years to collect was gone, washed away by the sea. Papers were scattered everywhere, wet and unreadable. Aisha knelt down and picked up a few sheets, but the ink had faded. She sat there in silence, the reality sinking in. Her work, her research, her years of effort, everything had vanished overnight. She thought of all the reports she had written, all the warnings she had given. She remembered standing before the mayor and the council, trying to make them understand. But now there was no council, no mayor, and no town left to protect. Nature had spoken in a way no one could ignore. She looked up at the ocean, shining under the pale morning sun, and whispered, "You tried to warn us, didn't you?" For a moment she closed her eyes and listened to the sound of gentle waves touching the shore. It was hard to believe that the same sea had been a monster just a few hours ago. The peace felt strange, almost cruel. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she whispered a quiet prayer for those who had been lost. She knew many of her friends and students had not survived the storm. The pain felt too heavy, but she also knew she couldn't give up. A group of volunteers from nearby towns arrived by midday. They brought food, water, and medical aid. Aisha joined them without hesitation. She bandaged wounds, handed out supplies, and comforted crying children. Despite her exhaustion, she worked tirelessly, trying to bring some order to the chaos. At one point, a little boy tugged on her sleeve. He was holding a small glass tank covered in mud. Inside it, floating in a bit of water, was a single coral fragment, tiny but alive. "I found this near your lab," he said shyly. "I think it's yours." Aisha stared at the coral, unable to speak for a moment. She gently took the tank and looked at the delicate creature inside. It was breathing, its soft edges moving slightly under the water. It was the only thing from her lab that had survived. "Thank you," she said softly to the boy, her voice trembling. That small coral became a symbol for her, a sign that not everything was lost. Life, fragile as it was, still found a way to hold on. Over the next few weeks, rescue teams continued their work. Bodies were found and mass burials took place. Families cried together, mourning their loved ones. The town that had once been full of joy now stood quiet, wrapped in sadness. Yet even in that silence, something new began to grow. People started to rebuild. Fishermen repaired their boats. Women cooked meals for volunteers, and children collected wood to help make shelters. Aisha kept the small coral tank close to her. She placed it on a table inside the temporary camp, checking it every day, cleaning the water and feeding it nutrients. She talked to it as if it could understand her. "You're a survivor just like us," she would say softly. The other survivors often came to look at it too. To them, it was more than a coral. It was hope. One day, a journalist from the city arrived to report on the disaster. When she interviewed Aisha, she asked, Do you think this was nature's revenge? Aisha shook her head. No, she said firmly. Nature doesn't take revenge. It reacts. This was not punishment. It was a warning. We hurt the earth for too long, and this is what happens when the balance is broken. Her words touched many. The journalist published her story under the headline, "The Woman Who Listened to the Ocean." Soon, people from around the country began to take notice. Environmental groups reached out to Aisha, asking her to share her research and experience. She traveled to nearby cities, speaking at schools, universities, and community centers. She told people the truth in simple words. We think we own the earth, but we are only guests. If we do not take care of our home, it will stop taking care of us. Her calm and honest voice moved many hearts. Months passed, and Marang slowly began to heal. New houses were built on higher ground, and the community started planting trees to protect the coastline. The government, realizing the mistake of ignoring environmental warnings, passed new laws against dumping waste into the sea. Factories were forced to clean up their operations, and stricter environmental checks were introduced. The ocean still carried scars, but small signs of recovery began to appear. Fishermen reported seeing a few fish returning near the reefs, and the mangrove trees started growing again. Aisha continued her work with even greater determination. With help from international organizations, she built a new marine research center near the hills, far from the reach of future storms. She called it the Hope Lab. Inside, she placed the small coral that had survived the storm. Under her care, it began to grow, spreading tiny branches of color. Every time she looked at it, she remembered that life, no matter how fragile, always finds a way to begin again. Despite the progress, there were still moments when Aisha felt overwhelmed by memories of that night. The screaming wind, the crashing waves, the faces of those who didn't make it. Sometimes she would walk down to the shore at sunset, sit quietly and talk to the sea. We're trying to do better, she would whisper. I promise we are learning. The waves, soft and rhythmic, seemed to listen. One evening, a group of schoolchildren came to visit her lab. She showed them the coral and explained how it had survived the storm. It's small, but it's alive, she told them. And if something so tiny can survive the fury of the sea, imagine what we can do if we care for our planet together. The children listened wide-eyed, and one of them said, We'll protect the ocean. Miss Aisha. She smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. That night, as she walked home, she looked up at the stars. For the first time in many months, the sky was clear and full of light. She thought about all the people who had helped rebuild the town, all the children who were now learning to love the earth, and all the survivors who had found courage again. She realized that even though the storm had taken so much, it had also given them something powerful, a new understanding of how deeply connected humans were to nature. The sea that had once destroyed their homes was now their greatest teacher. It had shown them how fragile life could be, but also how strong people could become when they stood together. Aisha knew the world would face many more storms in the years to come, but she also knew that change had begun. People were listening now. One morning, as she stood by the coral tank, she noticed something new. A tiny baby fish swimming near the coral branches. It must have come in through the water filter, but to her it felt like a miracle. She smiled and whispered, Welcome home. It was a simple moment, but it filled her heart with hope. Aisha decided to write a book about her experience. She wanted the world to remember what had happened in Marang, not as a tragedy, but as a lesson. She titled it, One Cry, One Earth. It told the story of how the planet speaks through storms, floods, and droughts, how every cry from nature is a message to wake up and change. When the book was published, it touched hearts around the world. From scientists to students, people began talking about environmental responsibility. Documentaries were made, donations were sent to rebuild coastal communities, and new projects began to restore coral reefs. The world had finally started to listen to the kind of warnings Aisha had once shouted alone. Years later, as she stood once again on the same pier, now rebuilt stronger than before, Aisha felt peace. The sea was calm, the wind gentle, and the sky clear. She knew the ocean would always have its storms, but she also knew that humanity had learned something important. She looked at the horizon and whispered, We heard your cry, Mother Earth, and this time we will not ignore it. The waves rolled softly toward the shore, as if answering her promise. Years passed since the great storm that changed everything, The small coastal town of Marang, once wiped out by nature's fury, was now slowly becoming a place of hope and rebirth. The land that had once been covered with mud and ruin now showed signs of life. The air smelled cleaner, the sky looked clearer, and people had learned to live with more care for the earth. Yet, the scars of that day still lived quietly inside everyone's heart, like shadows that never fully disappeared. Dr. Aisha Rahman, now known as the voice of the ocean, had become a symbol of resilience and change. Her book One Cry One Earth had inspired millions around the world. She had traveled to dozens of countries, speaking to leaders, scientists, and ordinary people about the importance of listening to the planet. Everywhere she went, people told her how her story gave them courage to protect their environment, no matter how small their contribution was. But despite her growing fame, Aisha never forgot her home. She always returned to Marang after every trip, to walk by the sea that had once destroyed her world, but had also taught her its deepest lesson. One evening, she stood on the same shore where the first coral fragment had been found years ago. The waves moved gently, their rhythm like a heartbeat. In the distance, children laughed as they played near the new mangrove forest that had been planted after the disaster. The mangroves now stood tall and green, protecting the coastline from strong winds and waves. The sight filled Aisha's heart with peace. She knew this was what she had fought for, not fame or recognition, but this simple harmony between people and nature. Inside her lab, the coral that had survived the storm had grown into a large, beautiful colony. Its branches spread like a miniature forest underwater, full of tiny fish and sea creatures. Scientists from around the world visited her to study how it survived and grew, even after being exposed to the harsh conditions of the storm. Aisha often looked at it and smiled. "You are a survivor," she would whisper. "You remind us that healing takes time, but it's always possible." Despite all the progress, Aisha knew the fight was not over. Climate change was still a threat to the entire world. Floods, wildfires, and droughts were happening in other countries just as she had feared. She often watched the news and saw people suffering in different corners of the planet. It broke her heart, but it also made her more determined. "We can't stop the storms," she said during one of her speeches, "but we can stop making them worse." Her voice carried across nations, reaching those who had once ignored such warnings. One day, a group of students from a foreign university came to visit her research center. They wanted to learn from her experience and help expand the coral restoration project. Among them was a young girl named Lena, who reminded Aisha of her younger self, curious, passionate, and full of questions. Lena asked, "Dr. Aisha, do you ever get tired of fighting for the earth when people keep destroying it?" Aisha smiled gently and replied, "Of course, I get tired sometimes. But when I look around and see life still growing, I remember that the earth hasn't given up on us yet. So why should we give up on it?" That simple answer stayed with Lena and the others. They spent weeks working beside Aisha, planting coral fragments, testing water quality, and recording ocean temperatures. Aisha watched them with quiet pride. She knew that the future of the earth depended on these young minds, on their understanding and love for nature. She often told them, "Don't think you're too small to make a difference. Even the tiniest coral can rebuild a whole reef one branch at a time." One evening, a strange stillness filled the air. The sky darkened and the wind began to blow stronger. Memories of the old storm flashed through Aisha's mind, but this time she didn't feel fear, only readiness. She quickly called her team and the townspeople. They moved boats inland, secured the houses, and sheltered together in the new safe buildings built on higher ground. The storm arrived with roaring winds and heavy rain, but this time the people were prepared. The mangroves stood firm. The new drainage systems worked and the seawalls held. When morning came, the damage was minimal. Aisha stepped outside and looked around. The sea had tested them again, but they had survived without tragedy. She smiled softly and whispered, "We learned your language." The ocean, calmer now, sparkled under the golden sun, almost as if it nodded in approval. The town had faced its test and passed. For Aisha, it felt like a quiet victory, not against nature, but with it. In the following months, her research center expanded. Scientists collaborated with local fishermen, turning Marang into a model town for environmental cooperation. Solar panels covered rooftops, clean water systems were installed, and children learned about climate care in schools. People from other countries came to study Marang's success, calling it the town that listened. Aisha often said, "Listening is the first step to healing." The Earth has been crying for so long. We just needed to hear her. One morning, Aisha received an invitation from the United Nations to speak at a global climate summit. It was the highest honor of her career. Standing before world leaders in a grand hall, she began her speech not with data or statistics, but with a story. She told them about Marang, the night the storm came, the people who lost everything, and the small coral that survived. The hall fell silent as she spoke. Her words were simple but powerful. "The Earth has one cry," she said softly. "When she suffers, we all suffer. When she heals, we all heal. The choice is ours. Ignore her or stand beside her." When she finished, the hall erupted in applause. Some leaders even stood up, moved by her sincerity. After the summit, several countries pledged stronger action against pollution and deforestation. New projects were launched to protect coral reefs and coastal communities. Aisha returned home quietly, not for fame, but because she wanted to be near the ocean again. The sea breeze felt warm on her face as she stood by the shore, watching children build sandcastles. Life had come full circle. One evening, as the sun dipped into the horizon, painting the sky orange and pink, Aisha sat on the beach with Lena. They watched the waves touch the shore gently. Lena asked, "Do you think there will be a day when the Earth stops crying?" Aisha looked at the horizon and said, "Maybe not completely. The Earth will always cry in some way. But if enough of us listen and act with love, her cry will become softer, more like a song than a scream." Lena smiled and nodded. The two sat there quietly as the wind carried the smell of the sea. The world around them seemed peaceful, at least for now. Aisha felt a deep calm inside her. She knew she had done her part, and now it was time for the next generation to continue the fight. She had given her voice to the Earth, and that voice would echo long after she was gone. Years later, when Aisha was old and gray, she still visited the sea every morning. She would sit by the same coral tank, now home to hundreds of living corals, and feed them like a gardener caring for her flowers. Visitors often came to see her, calling her Mother of the Ocean. She would smile and say, "No, I am just her daughter." One morning, as the sun rose over Marang, Aisha closed her eyes and listened to the waves. The sound was like a lullaby, soft and endless. She thought about the storm, the losses, the pain, and the journey that followed. She realized that everything, every tear, every broken dream, had led to this peace. The Earth had cried once, but now there was harmony. After Aisha passed away, the town built a small memorial near the shore. It had a simple message carved in stone. She heard the Earth cry and she answered. Every year, on the anniversary of the Great Storm, the people of Marang gathered at the shore. They planted trees, cleaned the beach, and told stories about the woman who had taught them to listen to nature. The sea remained calm, as if it too remembered her. Over time, Marang became a symbol of what humanity could achieve when it worked with the Earth instead of against it. The coral reefs flourished, birds returned to the mangroves, and the air was filled with the songs of life once more. People from all over the world came to see this miracle, this place where a tragedy had turned into hope. And as the waves continued to kiss the shore, their sound seemed to whisper Aisha's words again and again, gentle, timeless and true. One cry, one Earth, unstoppable fury, unstoppable hope.